Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley. I direct our Europe work today, Europe work here at CSIS, and today we have an incredibly timely topic with a phenomenal panel. CSIS, in cooperation with the Center for New American Security, is releasing a new report. It's on our website, Transatlantic Economic Statecraft, the challenge to building a balanced transatlantic sanctions policy between the United States and the European Union. That is a bold, big title, but it certainly speaks to how sanctions is an increasing tool that the transatlantic community is using to enforce violations of international law. And this report, in many ways, is a capstone event for our visiting French fellow, Simone de Galbert, who is a diplomat on loan to CSIS for the past 2 years and has done phenomenal work on sanctions policy, looking at Iran, and this in some ways is the penultimate of his work. I am told, sadly, we must return him to the French diplomatic service at the end of next month, but Simone has done incredible work focusing on this issue, and this report is a product of much of his reflections over the past 2 years. We are so grateful that Liz Rosenberg is here with us today. Liz is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Liz has been shepherding this incredible thought process of examination of sanctions and asked Simone to write this piece as part of their series. So this is a great think tank cooperation and partnership, and we are absolutely delighted to have Liz here with us. So I just wanted to give you a very brief roadmap of our discussion. We're going to first turn to Simone, who will give you an overview of this new report, the highlights, and some of the reflections on how the transatlantic community can work together on sanctions policy. And then we will turn to Ambassador Dan Fried, the coordinator for sanctions policy at the Department of State, who was just in Europe last week, doing a great deal of consultation as the EU works towards making a final decision regarding the extension of sanctions against Russia for the next 6 months. And after Dan is done with his remarks, we're going to turn to Philip Ackermann, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the German Embassy here in Washington, to give us the view from Berlin. And increasingly, Washington looks towards Berlin for advice and counsel, whether that's vis-a-vis Russian relations or the internal workings of the EU. And then finally, we're asking Liz to give us a sort of a finishing perspective, perhaps taking a look at the private sector's role in sanctions policy. And then we'll do a coordinated, moderated conversation here, and then this incredible audience, which it's a great group here, will bring you into this conversation. So a fantastic hour and a half planned, looking at transatlantic policy on economic sanctions. And Simone, congratulations on this report, and we look forward to hearing the highlights. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Heather, for your very kind words, as well as for the environment that you have provided me here at CSIS to do these works and all the things we've done together here. So thanks very much. Thanks to Ambassador Fried and to Minister Ackermann for joining us. And last but not least, thanks to Liz and CNAS for the good work that we have put together on this report and on this event. I will let you, at least those that are interested in taking a closer look in the report, look at it. But let me just here outline, I think, the 3 main conclusions that I've reached in doing this work, and I'll try to bring a more U.S. Take a more U.S. angle to those conclusions that may be of more interest to you. The first conclusion that I reach is that the transatlantic partnership on sanctions, as it has developed over the past few years, is very much in the U.S. interest. It's also, in my view, in the European interest But when it comes to the United States, I think the very specific economic position of the European Union in terms of trade, in terms of the importance of its currencies, has provided the United States a very significant leverage to advance policy objectives that the United States would not have been able to advance without the Europeans. And when you look at Iran or Russia, which are the two most significant examples of the past few years in terms of sanctions regime, it's a fact that the United States by itself would not have had the leverage to try to attempt to change the behavior of those countries in what they have been doing against international norms. So that's one thing. The other thing which I think matters as well to the United States is the European ability to craft common foreign policy tools. The European common foreign and security policy is usually criticized much more often than it is lauded. But I think sanctions is something that the Europeans have managed to do with great success. It's a tool that Europeans have been able to use together. And going forward, I think it very much matters for the United States that Europeans are able to keep using it. So bottom line, sanctions are in the transatlantic sanctions are in the interest of the United States. Of course, for Europeans, they come at a cost. Because as I said, if Europeans have a stronger leverage on economies like Russia and Iran, necessarily sanctions are going to cost them more than they cost to the United States. But in the meantime, they are also geographically closer to Europe, and so they are a threat to European security as much as they are for that of the United States. So both parties, I think, benefit greatly from this cooperation. The second conclusion that I reached is the fact that, to me, the cooperation today is much healthier than it used to, but it is still facing significant challenging around the idea that the partnership remains, to me, in a situation of imbalance between the United States and the EU. I say healthier because if you look at past examples, the United States and European countries, even before the inception of the European Union, have struggled to see sanctions from the same eyes. There are several examples of the United States attempting to impose sanctions to advance foreign policy objectives that Europeans refused and declined to join. In 1982, the Reagan administration tried to impose the sanctions on European companies dealing with the USSR gas industry. The Europeans refused. In 1996, the United States tried to put in place secondary sanctions on the Europeans for their dealings with Iran and Cuba, and the Europeans refused. So if we look at that history and what we have been able to do in the past few years, which is creating ourselves a leverage to negotiate a comprehensive agreement with Iran, to get to a united response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but also to target the financing of terrorist organizations like the efforts that are unfolding against the Islamic State. I think in whatever we do today together to address security challenges, there is an economic dimension and there is a sanctions dimension. And so in that sense, the fact that we're able to cooperate is much healthier, even from the standpoint of the transatlantic security partnership. That being said, there are some challenges, and if there were no challenges, I wouldn't have written the report. And to me, the bulk of this challenge is to be able to develop a more balanced relationship. And when I talk about imbalance, there is an EU dimension and a US dimension. I think on the European side, we are facing limitations which are related to the very nature of what the European Union is. And by saying that, I mean that we have issues of implementation and of enforcement that are related to the fact that we adopt sanctions at the European level, but member states retain full authority to implement and enforce sanctions. And so there are many issues that derive from this very topic. For instance, the fact that we struggle sometimes to share intelligence that would be useful to enforce sanctions and to punish violators, for instance. But that's just an example. That's for the Europeans. I think on the US side, to some extent, the sanctions policy have been so successful that we have reached a point where US sanctions have had overreaching effects, which is to say that US sanctions are changing the behavior of non-US operators, even in the case where law doesn't prescribe it. And that is creating skepticism in European business circles, but also sometimes in governmental circles. And I think that is detrimental to our joint ability to use sanctions going forward. And that may even be detrimental to our ability to sustain the efforts that are ongoing. So the European institutional limitations is a constraint for Europeans to address the situation of imbalance, which is, I think, the most significant challenge to our transatlantic cooperation. So very quickly, a third conclusion. The European Union isn't going to turn into a federal state. That isn't a surprise to anybody, at least anytime soon. And so what we need to look at is incremental steps to enhance cooperation among member states, trying to find mechanisms to share intelligence when possible in order to sustain the existing sanctions, in particular those individual sanctions that are challenged to EU courts. That's for the Europeans. I think on the US side, there is already an acknowledgement that the overreach is an issue. And the US Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew, in a speech a couple of months ago, acknowledged that situation and the need for the United States to show a kind of restraint in the way it uses its most efficient sanctions. So I think we are getting to the point where the US is doing a lot to show more transparency, to outreach to the private sector. But it's going to be something that will need to be structural rather than just in the context of the implementation of the JCPOA, the Iran deal. Bringing balance will matter, considering the challenges that are ahead of us. I outlined several of them in the report, but I think there is no greater challenge in terms of our joint sanctions policy than sustaining the Russia sanctions regime, as long as the Minsk agreement isn't fully implemented. The Europeans have been able to sustain that regime so far, and I have always been confident that they would be able to. But I think we have also reached a point where there is an appetite for more substantive discussions with how we use that leverage that we have managed to create. And so the more we can be on the same ground and in a balanced environment, I think the more we will be able to address that challenge. So let me stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Simone, thank you so much. Dan, turning to you, last week you were quoted in the press by saying sanctions is the price of combating Russian aggression. And I look forward to your comments to help us understand the price of those actions.
Thank you. I'll start by expressing my profound agreement with what we have just heard, particularly with the proposition that the U.S. and Europe have learned how to work together on sanctions. And we started off, as has been mentioned, not working together terribly well. The Russia sanctions, however, are the first sanctions where the U.S. ever first case in which we set out to design our sanctions regime in cooperation with Europe from the 0 point. We've never done that before. We have often either pushed sanctions ourselves, hoped that Europe would follow, or we have sort of worked with Europe, but never systematically designed our own sanctions in consultation with Europe, and the results were wholly laudable, and if I had to do it again, I would do it again just the same way. We did so because we realized that in response to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, a unilateral American response would not be terribly effective. A response with Europe would have considerable added weight. And so it has. Given the history of sanctions, particularly the pipeline sanctions in the Reagan administration, we have learned, usually the hard way in the American administration to get it right. Now, in sanctions, one of the rules is don't forget what it is you set out to achieve. With respect to the Russia sanctions, we're not doing it to punish Russia for bad behavior. We are imposing sanctions in support of a political solution, particularly the Minsk Accords, which are a series of overlapping commitments which provide for a settlement of the situation in the Donbass. They don't include Crimea. So when we say that when the US and Europe say that we would remove sanctions should Minsk be fulfilled, we've also agreed informally, but I think pretty consistently, that we would retain our Crimea sanctions as long as Crimea is occupied by the Russians. But we will remove our sanctions once Minsk is fulfilled. This is an agreement we and the Europeans have. We have this at the G7 level, and it's important to sustain that agreement, and we have every intention of doing so. The cooperation with Europe, and particularly with European institutions, has an ironic element that Heather will remember, because American administrations for many years weren't sure what we thought of a strong Europe in general and with the strong institutions in Brussels in particular. And I'm saying this fully aware that in 2 days, the British will vote on their referendum. The Americans learned that a strong Europe of strong European institutions is a strategic asset, as my colleague said. And that profound realization took a while. But without it, we would not have been able to impose the kind of sanctions we did against Russia. We would not have been nearly as effective. In sanctions generally, and with Russia sanctions in particular, it is important to have patience, to mean what you say, and to stick with it. You cannot, in sanctions, be in a hurry. Remember the Iran sanctions? Year after year, it was an article of faith in this town and in institutions like this that the Iran sanctions were a failure. Year after year, until one day they were a success. So don't be in a hurry. Heather, you mentioned the price of sanctions. In policymaking generally, and in sanctions in particular, don't look for purity, or not too much purity. That is, sanctions have unintended consequences, and they always have costs. They have them to American firms who come into my office regularly and complain about all the losses they've suffered. So it's not just European companies, but it is most certainly some European companies. The complaints about losses are often exaggerated. Companies love to exaggerate. Pro-Russian lobbyists love to exaggerate. But exaggeration of losses doesn't mean that the losses don't exist. They do. They can be mitigated. They cannot be wished away. All of us in government love to present options of, no pain, all gain, low risk, high yield. They don't exist. All right? They don't exist. In sanctions, multilateral is better. Security Council resolutions are the gold standards. And we've got a Security Council resolution system for our North Korea sanctions, but that's going to be rare. The second, the silver standard, is regional with a core of the US and Europe. That's something we've learned, had been learning, and is a lesson which is sealed in now because of the Russia sanctions case. Work with Europe is critical. Work with the G7 can build on that work. Another lesson we've learned is that we all need to invest in sanctions capacity. And my colleague made reference to this. The European Union is learning that there's no substitute for having a strong sanctions center. OFAC didn't arise overnight. As I never have worked at OFAC, so this isn't self-serving. It's a pleasure to work with a competent, highly functional, quality bureaucracy. They don't always exist, okay? Treasury Department does a good job. I'm not saying this as a Treasury person, I'm not one. But it takes resources, and it takes resources to manage and sustain a sanctions program. You need to know when to end sanctions. You can't fall in love with your tools. You can't turn sanctions into a fetish. In the Russia sanctions program, we know what we want. We want Minsk to be fulfilled. The final lesson of sanctions is you have to mean it. You have to mean it. You have to be able to devote the political capital to sustain the sanctions, to deal with the business lobbyists. In the case of Russia, to deal with the army of Russian representatives, direct, indirect, declared, and non-declared, with the political fallout, with all of the problems that a sanctions regime brings. But if you follow some of these rules and work the diplomacy hard, which we are doing, sanctions can work. In Ukraine, if it weren't for sanctions, things, in our judgment, would be much, much worse. And if you think that they couldn't be worse, you just don't have enough imagination, quite frankly. The invasion might have been more sustained. It would have gone farther. There might be many, many more refugees. And without sanctions, I don't think we would have a Minsk process at all. The United States supports the Minsk process in general, and in particular, we support Germany and France that are in the trenches there, working with the Ukrainians and having to deal with the Russians, which is not always easy. The Russians, unfortunately, have not even begun to fulfill the first stages of the Minsk process, which starts with a ceasefire. There isn't any. And the responsibility is overwhelmingly with the Russian clients, the separatists. So sanctions have prevented things from getting worse. They have created the outline of a diplomatic solution. They have not brought us all the way there. And I applaud the fact that the European Union seems once again to be ready to roll over the sanctions and continue the pressure, hopefully leading to a solution. Now, I know there's lots more to say, but stop here and look forward to questions later.
Dan, thank you. Those are terrific comments, and I look forward to coming back to them. Philip, from perspective from Berlin.
Thank you, Heather. And let me first say that I really commend Simon for the good report. I think it's an excellent piece and worth reading. I think also you described extremely well the different angles we come from Europe and the US. I think it's no secret that Europe as a whole, and my country in particular, suffers more from sanctions than the US would do, and particularly when it comes to Russia or also Iran sanctions. And against this background, I think one has to state at the beginning here that the cooperation between Europe and the US and Germany and the US on sanctions is close, it is efficient, and it's also with a very similar mindset. We work, very, very closely with Ambassador Fried and his team, but also with OFAC, and we appreciate this cooperation. In particular, I think, our common stance in the aftermath of the illegal annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of eastern Ukraine. That does not mean that there are no disagreements. Every now and then we disagree on cases, but overall I would say we both work in harmony and solidarity. Ambassador Fried, I hope you note that I say harmony and solidarity on the sanctions issue. We do so, and I think because we are convinced that sanctions can be a useful tool to build up political and economic pressure that leads to resolving a crisis through negotiations. And I think I would say Iran is a good example how sanctions did their job, and I will talk about Iran in a minute. South Africa is perhaps another success, which is the best of all so far. But on the other hand, you have to see that sanctions, in the sanctions issue, success is not a given. Iraq, North Korea are examples where sanctions were not or are not yet successful. So I think that's the German point of view. We have to decide very carefully whether or not to impose sanctions. And I think as a general rule, they should not be overused. It's a very easy tool, it's easy to understand, and it's quickly decided, but we feel that it should be used with caution. And we would say that sanctions are never the instruments of first choice. There's always the risk of escalation or harsh counter-reactions. There's also the risk of harming people who we would not intend to harm, the impoverished layers of Russian society, for example, in the country concerned, but also third parties. 40% of Finnish dairy production went to Russia. So when the Russians hit with counter sanctions, the Finnish dairy industry had a problem. Now I think Finns are eating much more cheese nowadays, but it is a problem for an economy like Finland. And not even worse, another example is Greece, an economy that struggles to get out of a deep crisis and lives on tourism. And the Russian tourism in Greece was a very, very big source of income for the Greeks, and it went down considerably because of the sanctions. So for Greece, it was a problem. You should not forget that sanctions harm third economies which don't deserve to be harmed by them in a way. It's also fair to say that sanctions are not an objective in itself. They are a tool to help achieve something, showing resolve and sending signals of strength, certainly, but most to get to honest and result-oriented negotiations. And that implies also that sanctions are not intended, and I think Ambassador Fried just said it, to bring another party to its knees. Russia sanctions, for example, nobody has an interest in ruining the Russian economy. I think we all agree such an outcome would not enhance Europe's security. So if we consider sanctions as a tool, one of their main functions is to create incentives for political change that can bring an end to the conflict. And if there is such a change, then consequentially sanctions should be eased, and this sanctions relief should be noticeable. If we fail to do so, we undermine our own credibility and damage the sanctions instruments for the future. I know that the US is always very, very nervous when it comes to a rollover in Europe concerning the Russian sanctions, and I think Ambassador Fried is right to say that you can breathe in, breathe out. It looks good for the rollover end of this month. Every 6 months we have that concern, and I think Germany, I say that with all modesty, works hard to keep this unity amongst the 28, so does France, I'm sure, and we have been, through the Minsk process, we have been instrumental to get these 28 together, which is not always an easy task. But we should not forget that this discussion we should have on the Russian problem is not about the right tools, as they are not the end of the discussion in itself. Rather, we should focus on how to make progress in implementing the Minsk agreement. And then, in a second step, discuss what this progress, or in this case, and Ambassador Fried rightly said, a lack of progress, means for our sanctions regime. And this brings me to Iran. I just mentioned that I would talk about Iran a bit. After more than 10 years of negotiations, we reached an historic breakthrough last summer in the decades-old dispute over the danger of the Iranian nuclear program. And I think breakthrough is the right word here, not only because it makes sure that Iran will not get hold of a nuclear weapon, but also because it allows Iran to follow a new path. And with this creation of the so-called P5+1, a new formula of negotiation team proved to be successful. Actually, we call it E3+3 because we feel with P5+1 we are a bit lonely. So E3+3 is nicer with us. I think from a German and European point of view, this is a great success. Why did it work? What did we do right? Let me give you 3 central conclusions. First, we clearly concentrated on the talks. The sanctions prepared negotiations, but are not a substitute for talks. These sanctions brought Iran to the table. Without the international sanctions, I doubt that we could have achieved the JCPOA, but here again, it is clear that sanctions were not a substitute for this intense and long negotiation period. Second, the sanctions were successful because they were nearly global and because they targeted crucial fields of the Iranian economy. They were successful because the US, the EU, Russia, China, and most of the other big world economies all cut its economic ties with Iran. The sanctions on oil provided a powerful base to build on. The most crucial point later was maybe when Iran was cut off from the European financial transaction system in 2012. Colleagues who served at our embassy in Tehran, at that time they recall how big the impact was from one day to the other after this it's called SWIFT, after this financial sanction system in 2012. Third, to build a credible negotiation narrative through sanctions, the perspective of the sanctions being lifted needs to be clear, concrete, and real. Already the interim agreement, JPOA, had built in a clear-cut promise of sanctions relief. Then the JCPOA, the final document, might be a new gold standard for future cases on how to link and sync steps that each side must take before implementation, and a detailed list of sanctions being lifted if each partner keeps its promise. This step-by-step manual, in this case, brought Iran and the P5+1 through the preparation period and allowed to start implementation sooner than many of us expected in January 2016. So I think, as I said, Iran was a success. But we should not sweep some challenges and problems that still exist under the carpet. Now that we want to successfully implement the deal, Iran needs to get the benefit of its promises. As the US maintains the sanctions which were not related to Iran's nuclear program, because your Congress obliges you so, we need to provide certainty to our companies which want to re-engage in Iran about what is allowed and what is not. We still feel a certain hesitation in many German companies and banks to that extent. And this is the last thought here, brings me to the question of secondary sanctions. And there I say Germany, and I would say that is also valid for most of European countries, are very uncomfortable with the concept. We took note of Secretary Liu, and I think, Simon, you just mentioned it. He said that we should really carefully examine the secondary sanctions question, and we appreciate his clear statement. As we know that the effects secondary sanctions are often a reason for concerns of German companies and others too. So to conclude here, I think the best solution is to closely cooperate whenever we design and implement sanctions from the very beginning, and in order to achieve the greatest possible coherence. So I think on Iran we have proven to be successful. We hope that on the Russia case we will be successful too. It's not that far, unfortunately, but it's extremely important that the transatlantic cooperation on this issue continues. Otherwise, it's not going to be resolved. Thank you.
Philip, thanks so much. Those were a really thoughtful paradigm, particularly on the success of Iran. I want to come back to that, maybe talk through Russia a little bit. Liz, why don't you bring us home on some of the issues that you've been focusing on in your research?
Well, I will, although you don't leave me all that much because, in fact, you've all done an excellent job. So let me just say congratulations to Simon on a great paper. It's my pleasure to have been able to collaborate with CSIS and support him in this work. I think it's a really important contribution to the conversation in Washington on sanctions and also between transatlantic partners on this relationship and the coordination that exists. Excuse me. So, as we've heard already about some of the political challenges and successes and lessons, if you will, of sanctions, I wanted to spend just a little bit more time on the private sector. 2 points. The first one on private sector issues. And the reason I think that's important, as I see some of you I know in the audience, and I think you may agree, the private sector winds up being the leading edge, the implementers, the first responders, if you will, for sanctions, charged with carrying them out in practice and, in fact, implementing a policy. Some people don't choose to see it that way, but I think it's useful to try that on as an exercise if you feel uncomfortable with it, because it underscores a couple of really important factors that have come up as operational issues for the policymakers contemplating the sanctions they want to put in place and some of the challenges that they face and how to do that. So first, thinking about companies that don't consider themselves U.S. companies, first and foremost, that may be European in the case of thinking about transatlantic relationships, but foreign to begin with or multinational, they don't often manage to escape exposure to U.S. jurisdiction, of course. And they may seek that, of course. It's the U.S. is so important for global supply chains and for global financial activities, particularly since the financial crisis. The U.S. this economy has been a good place to store value and to do business. And so what that means is that U.S. sanctions, even just primary sanctions, thinking about primary sanctions and setting aside secondary ones, have this serious impact for foreign companies. And that may be, in the mind of many, a very good thing. And I think there is an appreciation amongst some foreign companies that the U.S. has been so extensive in the execution and application of its sanctions, because for a number of foreign companies that don't have the resources in-house to identify bad actors or malicious actors, in fact, it's very helpful to have a list of known terrorists or proliferators that they want to stay away from, or certain guidance about how to manage their commercial retail operations in jurisdictions that are considered high risk. However, there's also a lot of frustration about how broad U.S. jurisdiction is, and confusion about what U.S. jurisdiction is. So U.S. persons to which primary sanctions apply is I think, at its heart, a subject of much confusion for many people internationally. It doesn't just mean U.S. citizens, wherever they are in the world, or U.S. incorporated companies, wherever they may operate, if they're indeed U.S. incorporated, not necessarily their subs, but they're subs for the purpose of Iran sanctions, so to add a complication, and then anyone in the United States, whether a U.S. citizen or not. So there's this frustration that I think related to the confusion abroad that Simon touches upon in his report, which I think is very useful. And some people think of this as, they link this with their sense of overreach or overuse of U.S. sanctions. And I think U.S. policymakers would push back on that and say, well, this is U.S. jurisdiction, this is what we're responsible for. We want to try and keep it safe from abuse by bad actors here, and we'll stick primarily to our bread and butter, to U.S. sanctions. And it may be the case, I think a number of U.S. policymakers will acknowledge some of this frustration or confusion that exists outside of the United States by companies that also wind up implementing U.S. sanctions because they are exposed to U.S. jurisdiction. Let me just call out a couple of reasons why I think this frustration exists. One is that these excellent bureaucrats that Dan mentioned in OFAC, for example, there's only so many of them, and there's a lot of questions internationally. And so with even a diligent, highly competent group of public officials working on answering questions and offering licenses, there's still only so many of them. And furthermore, I think some of this confusion or frustration in the transatlantic relationship on sanctions has to do with the fact that while policymakers may do have particular views and policy intentions about how to move forward on the Russia program, on Iran sanctions, they don't make the rules or the playbook for law enforcement officials. So companies out there trying to implement this are thinking about both what policymakers say and also what the banking supervisors or other regulatory agencies will say, and trying to figure out Is there total consistency? Will this change in the future based on personalities that exist in these different institutions? And furthermore, for those competent officials at OFAC, there's a pretty narrow view about to whom they will give guidance, which is to say, in most cases, just to U.S. persons. So if you are a foreign company, because that is what their jurisdiction extends to. So if you're a foreign company and you have questions about what this means, how do I implement it, what exactly does this mean I can do with respect to Russia or Iran, in fact, it may be challenging to get the answers you want out of U.S. officials. And U.S. officials say, well, that's not our problem, sorry for you, but we're just looking at our jurisdiction. So helpfully, I think Simone points out a number of these issues in various ways in this paper. They're worth a lot of conversation because operationally, it has an effect on public policy. The other point I wanted to make quickly is that one of the things I really appreciate about Simone's paper and the conversation we can have here today is that it brings up some of the the points of friction, if you will, or some of the perceptions problems or differences of perceptions that exist in Europe and the European community in the United States. And I don't want to be too broad sweeping here. Of course, there are different perspectives in Europe. There are definitely different perspectives in the United States, but it's useful to put them out in front of us and talk about them together. Some of the ones he calls out that we might just spend a little time on in the course of our conversation, I expect we will. Thinking about, I think, a perception he offers that is held by many internationally, including in Europe, that the U.S. overuses its sanctions or doesn't have restraint. I think in the United States, that would be surprising for many people here. Many people think that the U.S. administration is actually quite restrained. And by contrast to some of the more aggressive views in the U.S. Congress, the U.S. administration has gone to extreme lengths. And I say this as someone who I feel like I helped support the administration efforts to be restrained and restrain some of Congress's more aggressive attempts to go to great lengths, but in sanctions. So that difference in perception about how aggressive U.S. sanctions are or how overused or used they are is an important one to spend a little time on. And furthermore, as has been discussed, I think, both explicitly and more opaquely here already, what is the extent of U.S. policymakers or regulatory officials to explain to the rest of the world what they're able to do and what they're not? So to the point I was making before about U.S. regulatory officials offering licenses or guidance to U.S. companies, how extensive is that? It's an open discussion, it's a live discussion, it has pretty important public policy significance in that in the Iran case, we've already seen this very profound, pervasive narrative in Europe and elsewhere linking the ability, I think wrongly so, but in many cases, linking the ability of the U.S. to give guidance beyond its jurisdiction to foreign companies with success of the nuclear deal. So that perception issue actually winds up having, this operational issue winds up having a very significant public policy effect. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We've had a wonderful sweep from the policy to the practice and all the challenges and the opportunities in between. Let me just, for clarity, sort of make sure we all understand, and the panel, please correct me if I'm wrong, the current state of play as we understand where the decision that the EU is going to extend sanctions for another 6 months. Yesterday, there was a meeting of EU ambassadors, co-repair, that agreed to extend those sanctions for another 6 months, so at the technical level. There may be a meeting of foreign ministers on Friday, obviously unclear with events on June 23rd, what Europe will be and what meetings will be held. But this is, there's a potential that this will be just a technical decision made by the end of this week, or perhaps it will be a leaders' discussion, the European Council, June 28th and 29th, that will actually confer that those sanctions are going to be rolled over, and if anyone has a different sense of that, but that's my understanding of the current state of play. What I want to touch upon is the question of sustainment. And Philip, and you mentioned in your, that I love the Iran comparison. I feel another great think tank study coming in to look at those comparisons of what was successful for the Iran situation. Can those factors of success be employed for Russia? The thought for me, for Europe to sustain a sanctions regime against Russia for 10 years, when every 6 months we sort of go, and we hope. And I think, to be honest with you, and again, please argue with me, the panel, I really think the signaling, at least the public signaling that we are getting from this current extension is this will probably be the last 6-month full extension, that there may go to, some have suggested, a 3-month review, or that there will be some significant staging, if you will, if progress is made, recognition of that. So I'm wondering, how do we get through the challenge of sustainment? Because in some ways this is a race against cost and fatigue. Who's going to be more fatigued or more harmed by this? And democracies are always more immediately harmed because they're paying the price for enforcing a policy. And when democracies don't want to bear that burden, if their elected officials are saying they don't wish to bear that burden, how do you create that policy of sustainment? So I just want to, for all the panelists, and we can go through very quickly, I'd love for you to think through that question. And then finally, I absolutely hear both the report echoes this, Simone echoes this, Liz echoes this point of friction of uncertainty. But isn't that the point? Isn't that the point of making sanctions more effective, if you will? The clarity there is in part, you're not having an instrument there. If we aren't sure whether Russia can continue a bond sale, we're not sure banks should participate in that, aren't we furthering the imposition of cost, if you will, for them to find that? So I'm going to be a bit provocative there. And so why don't we just, Simone, if you can touch on sustainment, and isn't uncertainty part of a toolkit that we may not want to ultimately clarify?
To a certain extent, I think your two questions are related, because I think it's difficult to sustain sanctions if we based our policy on uncertainty, for the very reason that uncertainty is not very compelling for the private sector, and in turn for governments that are in touch with them. So let me just go back quickly to your two questions. On Russia, it's a little bit like the movie Groundhog Day, where every 6 months, and it's been the 4th time now that we've been doing that, many people are concerned that the Europeans are not going to roll over the sanctions. Some EU officials are making ambiguous statements about their own view of the interest and the added value of the sanctions, and at the end of the day, the European Union rolls over its Russia sanctions technically without significant disagreements. So I think you, and when I say you, it's audiences in the United States, need to trust the Europeans a little bit more sometimes. Russia is a much more significant actor to sanction than Iran, geopolitically, strategically, economically, historically. So it's politically tougher. That being said, sanctions have been adopted. They are here, and they will remain so for the next 6 months. And perhaps I will be proven wrong, but perhaps in 6 months we will discover that they are rolled over once again if the Minsk agreement isn't, if significant progress hasn't been made on the implementation of the Minsk agreement. A last point. I used to work a lot on Iran sanctions during the negotiation of the JCPOA, and for a long time we had this vision that sanctions as a whole would only be lifting when Iran would fully implement the resolution of the UNSC. And that position could be held for a certain amount of time because the Iranians were not cooperating at all. And then came a point where there was a spirit of cooperation that was brought back on the Iranian side. And then we have to face the difficult question of what do we do? Do we stick to purity? Or do we try to be pragmatic and try to think about a step-by-step approach? And at the end of the day, this is the very question we might face in the unpacking of the Russia sanctions regime. We might face, but we are not there yet. We are at the point where the situation on the ground allows us to retain this purity approach. We might need to think about a more flexible way of approaching this if the situation changes, but somehow this is a theoretical discussion so far. So that's where we are. So I haven't really responded to your uncertainty. But
Perfect. And Dan, this is very unfair, but before you comment, as I was watching some of the live coverage from the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, certainly quite a different environment from 2 years ago, where certainly both European leaders, U.S. companies were represented there. Do you sense that from what you were watching while you were in Europe at the time of the St. Petersburg Forum that there is starting to be cracks in this from both the private sector and from governments?
Well, every 6 months, I've had to deal with questions just like that. The fact is, as Simone said, Europe has proven the skeptics wrong at each turn. There were many in Washington, many in Brussels, and a whole lot of people in Moscow who bet against Europe. I suspect strongly that the Russian leadership felt comfortable betting against Europe, and they were proven wrong, and I believe they will be proven wrong again. This is a period of general Euroscepticism, but Europe deserves enormous credit for a sustained exercise in political will on a tough issue, not a secondary issue. This is tough. Companies are going to do what they do. Some of them will try to evade sanctions, and I look forward to being able to discover them and go after them. Other companies will figure out where the line is and approach it as best they can. And we have, as a government, the United States has to be straight and fair about this. We have to try to maintain a level playing field for European firms, American firms, and frankly, G7 firms. And that's not always easy, but we're doing so on the basis, as Philippe said, of a common political commitment, and that makes the conversations much, much easier. And believe me, I know what difficulties with Europe are like, right? I wasn't in the Bush administration first term for nothing. You know, that's when it's bad, okay? This is not bad, this is good. Secondly, Simone is right. There's a lot of talk about new flexible approaches to sanctions, and I want to say, well, wait a minute. The US and Europe have a common position that we maintain sanctions as they are until Minsk is fulfilled. That's our common position. It doesn't seem to me automatic that we should reward Russian failure to do its part on Minsk by weakening our own position unilaterally. How does that make sense? Now, if the question is, how would we respond to positive developments in the Minsk framework? I'll put that in the category of, that's a good problem to have, and ask me when there's some good developments. But I don't see that we need, as Simone said, I don't see that we need to have a completely abstract discussion. But I'm not going to live in terror of responding to good developments. Equally hypothetical question, and we don't need to have this discussion, but since one hypothetical has come up, I'll pose the other half. So if there's no progress on Minsk, Shouldn't we increase the sanctions? That's not a U.S. proposal, please. That's a hypothetical attempt at intellectual balance, right?
Oh, a diplomat.
Sustainment of sanctions is going to be an issue. Of course it is, which is why we should only go into this if we mean it. But if the Russians are deciding whether or not to respect Minsk, they're going to look at really three factors. They're going to look at Ukraine's ability to resist, both militarily and politically. They're going to look, frankly, at America's presidential cycle, and that's the only thing I'll say on that subject. And they're going to look at Europe. And if all three of those factors go in the right direction, the chances of a successful outcome in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine rise enormously. All right, so that's how I would think of the issue of sustainment. And there's more I could say about overreach, but, you know, the so-called U.S. overreach of sanctions, but that's for a different question.
Perfect.
Briefly, let me say that it's heartening to hear an American praise the European Union, because we sometimes forget how good we are. And I think your president did it wonderfully, actually, in Hanover and London. And I think this Russia example is a perfect example. You have 28 countries, some of them in an emerging state economically, I would say. You know, I'm not talking about my country, but Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary, people who, I mean, economies who rely very heavily on the Russian exchange, and so far we have proven Putin wrong, actually, you know, because I think he's right. You are right, Dan. His bet was that the Europeans would crumble after a while, and they did not. And when we do this every 6 months and create some nervousness in the United States, I think Simon is right saying, don't be too nervous, you know, because you should not forget Minsk is our process. Yeah? It's a German, French, European process. US is not sitting at a table. It's our own credibility that is at stake. If we don't come up with progress in Minsk, I mean, we have a problem to explain why we should lift sanctions then, you know. I mean, increasing sanctions, if Minsk is not, might be intellectually an honest and fair point. I'm not sure whether in reality we would go that far, frankly. But I think so far we have seen every 6 months saying, okay, we'll roll over again, and then we'll have a discussion. We'll see what happens in fall. Maybe they postpone their discussion also. I mean, this is. It's, you know, Europe is working behind the curtains and trying to pull strings. So I think so far the European Union has proven very, very steadfast and extremely decided and resolved. And can I add, in order to, perhaps somebody in the audience will vote the day after tomorrow in order to make the European case even more, even stronger, is that Europe was instrumental in this JCPOA thing. You know, I mean, the European Union was one of the main negotiators at the table, and I think they did a pretty brilliant job at the end of the day. But let me come back to your uncertainty point, and I think if I get your remark right, and I think Simon said something at the beginning which is of course very true, that secondary sanctions and this uncertainty is extremely effective. I mean, this is the most effective, you said this is the most efficient way of dealing with sanctions, and I think this is, you know, when you are in a tough time like we are with Russia now, or we were with Iran a couple of months or a year ago. That's very helpful. It is not helpful if you are interested in get things going. Yeah? And we have the absurd situation right now that we are encouraging our banks to deal with Iran because we want Iran to see the benefit of their deal, and so are the Americans basically. But our banks say, oh, no, we have made so problematic experience with the Americans when it comes to that. We rather refrain from doing business with Iran. So this uncertainty can, you know, turn into something which we don't want at the end of the day, and therefore we need clarity. And I think OFAC is really trying hard, and we have seen, you know, an outreach which is which is really good and commendable, but at the end of the day, there are still uncertainties which should be resolved in the cases where everybody, including the US, is interested that things get going. Thank you.
So again, I'll play cleanup on this. I think, and I'm actually just going to speak to the issue of uncertainty. Much useful commentary has been offered already on the issue of sustainability, but on uncertainty, I think basically this is a methodological issue. And I have heard smart people argue the issue of the role of uncertainty in sanctions in different directions. And that conversation is had in the United States amongst different stakeholders or interest groups, if you will, as well as between transatlantic counterparts. And I think that the reason we are having this conversation is because there is not methodological agreement or coherence in the United States or between transatlantic partners on the role of uncertainty in sanctions. And sanctions are it's a dynamic policy instrument. The political circumstances change. The creativity and the development of sanctions authorities changes and evolves, and new authorities are rolled out. So, of course, this is appropriate that it should be an ongoing conversation. But basically, for the people who argue for the value of preserving uncertainty in sanctions, it is, I think, uncontested that there's a major economic effect associated with uncertainty, and certainly for anyone in the position of having to try and plan a business strategy around uncertainty, it can be expensive, in many ways abstract and tangible, such as cost of borrowing and inability to align your supply chain for a known progression of business activities and the like. But to just point out the flip side of this on the argument for why uncertainty is not beneficial, basically, I think this comes down to what have been a couple of relatively clear lessons learned in the recent past in the Iran case demonstrated and elsewhere, such that if you clearly align, as Dan had mentioned before, your objectives, your end state objectives, with the financial impositions associated with sanctions that are put in place, if you stick to the playbook and everyone understands the rules, then there's more predictability. And then there's a true belief that, in fact, there is an incentive, that is to say, rolling back sanctions or rolling back these financial impediments for the object of the sanctions. And, in fact, you may be able to have a more successful pairing of diplomacy with sanctions if there is certainty, if there is a clear off-ramp, and by extension, you may be able to have greater certainty in calibrating the effect of your economic measures or your sanctions, which also has great value for political strategists and diplomats. So this is a methodological issue, and I think the jury is definitely out amongst the policymaking community if we understand that as parliamentary and administrative and across both sides of the Atlantic.
Fantastic. Let's welcome our audience into this discussion. We have some colleagues with microphones. If you could please raise your hand, identify yourself with your name and your affiliation. We want to get as many questions in as we can, so I'll ask you to keep the questions very concise, the comments very short. What we'll do is we'll bundle those questions and then allow our panelists to respond to them. All right, I see. We'll start up here, Andrew, and then we'll work our way back, and then I'll shift to the right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Great panel. Oops, Mr. Larson is here. Okay. Jean-François Boitin with TSG. Two quick questions to the panel. We have talked here about sanctions at the federal level, but there are many states or local governments that have their sanctions program that might be encouraged by the success in the Iran case to continue these programs going forward. What can be done about that? And my second question is on Iran. Very few companies, at least in my country, consider that the lifting of the sanctions is a success, because no bank wants to deal with Iran. They know that Ambassador Fried is going to go after them. They have been burned once, won't be burned twice. So essentially, there is no business for Iran after the lifting of the sanctions, or very few opportunities. Is there a risk that this fact will undermine the transatlantic cooperation on sanctions that Simone rightly pointed out to?
Okay. Gro Holm from the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, correspondent. I have one question to the European representatives on the panel. To what extent is the interest, or have the interests from the private business interests been voiced in your own countries, and have they accumulated into political pressure? I know in the French Parliament there has been discussions about the prolongation of the sanctions and also proposal to drop that. But provided that government and private businesses don't always have the coinciding interests, to what extent is this a political problem for your democracy and for your government?
Albert Nabiullin from AAAS. My question is also about private businesses. So today, Boeing announced a deal to sell airplanes, roughly a $25 billion deal. Several months ago, we had Airbus with a $27 billion deal. Are we starting to see more of an influx of private investment in Iran? And how is the U.S. Treasury going to respond to that? Because currently, U.S. Treasury has to approve all those deals so that they are in accordance with the agreement and the JCPOA. Thank you.
Seems like we have a lot of questions on Iran and private sector. Dan, do you want to jump in? And then I'll make sure Philippe and Simone and Liz.
Your question made clear that the proposition that there's no business in Iran after the JCPOA is simply wrong. And it isn't just American business, it's Boeing and Airbus. I won't speak for Treasury or OFAC, but I do notice that in its press release, Boeing pointed out that it had been in close contact with OFAC and was confident that this deal works. Without knowing the details of the Airbus deal, I think it is logical, and we all expected that Iran would reach out to both. In other words, not rely simply on Boeing. If the JCPOA is going to work, Iran has to get something out of it. That's very clear. The Iran sanctions are extraordinarily complex because there are multiple U.S. laws, Security Council resolutions, European sanctions, JCPOA. It's a thicket, and therefore very difficult. And therefore, the phenomenon of private businesses having to wade through this in a situation where the sanctions regime is complicated and still extant to some degree, because U.S. sanctions for human rights and counterterrorist sanctions remain, is complicated. The Russia sanctions regime, by contrast, is much simpler. But I'm pleased to hear that there is business going in to Iran in a sanction, in a way consistent with the JCPOA, because that's the only way all of this is going to work. It is also true that OFAC has been active, reaching out to European businesses as well as American businesses, and this is right. This is what they should be doing.
Liz, you had a comment on this, and then we'll switch to...
Yeah, just to add to a couple of things Dan said. First, I think I look at the Boeing deal as a measure. We should think of this as a measure of confidence in the JCPOA as an agreement. And furthermore, perhaps we could also think about it as a version of insurance, because for Iran to receive the benefit of this deal, which is a multi-billion-dollar deal, as you've pointed out, a multi-year deal, it's got to stick to the agreement for a period of time. So it is true that there are many companies in the United States and elsewhere that have had lots to say about, to this gentleman, to your question, that in fact the lifting of sanctions has not been a success. They do not feel the opportunity, they don't see the opportunity for doing business. I disagree with the premise here, and I think it's unhelpful when both critics of the deal and supporters offer that view, and don't also think about what the IMF and the World Bank and Transparency International and the Financial Action Task Force and various political and financial leaders in Europe, in the United States, the world over, have said about other what we could call prudential or systemic challenges doing business with Iran, having to do with their lack of adequacy according to international standards on financial disclosure, international tax issues, corruption, money laundering. The list goes on and on. Ease of doing business, uncertainty about legal restructures and recourse, their own internal inability to have clarified after several years the terms of their petroleum contract, which will be the primary vehicle for financial investment in that sector. So there are a host of other challenges doing business with the Iranian economy. And I would challenge the proposition that, in fact, sanctions have failed or companies can't invest just because of the sanctions. In fact, I wouldn't even put sanctions as the first problem with doing business with Iran.
Quite right.
Vidi?
Yeah, I can't express myself on this federal level and state level. I think this is an American problem I'm not very aware of. Perhaps somebody else could do that. But on the Iran thing, I think, generally speaking, first of all, we have an Iranian government that was kind of naive to think that, after the JCPOA, the very next day, they would explode with foreign investment. And that's not the case for very many reasons. Oil prices low. They are not a very reliable administration to a certain extent. And on the other hand, we have indeed companies who would be inclined to go to Iran and do business with Iran, but are unsure whether they can do it, and therefore we need clarification by basically our American friends, and we get these clarifications. It takes a while, but so far I think we have seen slowly progress, and if it's going on like this, I see in a half a year's time we'll see a better situation. Although it will never be as good as the Iranians, I think, imagined it would be after the sanctions lifting. I think they were a bit in an illusion when it comes to. It takes a while. Also, the private business has to get used to the fact that they are not, persecuted when they do business with Iran. It's a psychological thing. Also, it's not only a legal thing. It's more than that. When it comes to private business, your question, of course, like in this country, private business is organized and tries to influence political processes. And we, in Germany, we had a group within our business association, the East European/Russia group, that they very clearly advocated against the sanctions because they saw money disappearing, basically. That's what that made them, arguing against sanctions. I think, you might remember that 2 years ago when the whole crisis started, Germany was viewed as a wobbly candidate, not a very, very strong sort of advocate for sanctions. Again, that has been proven wrong so far. I think the government has made it very clear that in this context there is a primacy of politics very clearly, and the business has to abide by that. So I think there was clearly, and there are still attempts to influence politicians and political decision makers, but I think there is a consensus now, and this consensus is in Germany as well in other European countries, that this sanctions regime against Russia makes sense and has to be sustained for the time being.
On Iran, I would say that a lot has been done already by the United States in coordination with the Europeans to try to bring more transparency to how to untangle the lifting of sanctions, considering the complexity that Ambassador Fried referred to. And I would point you to the statement published a couple of weeks ago by Secretary Kerry, along with its E3 European counterparts, as to the efforts that the group is doing to try to bring to Iran the benefits of the deal. Now, I don't think that should be a concern for transatlantic unity, and we need to be very careful not to fall into that temptation. We are still a group of countries, the 3 Europeans, the United States, and of course Russia and China, trying to implement an agreement that was made with Iran. It's not Iran and the Europeans trying to get from the Americans things that are not supposed to happen upon the JCPOA. The implementation of the JCPOA is going to be a long game, and I wouldn't want to see a rift emerging between the US and its European allies. So, and I'm saying that in the sense that Europeans themselves need to be careful not to fall into that temptation once again. Very quickly on the private sector and the question that was raised about how the private sector interests are fueled into more official channels. I mean, private interests are legitimate, but the government's competence and authority to conduct foreign policy is as legitimate. And so it's normal that the government and the member states take into account the interest of their private sector and of course in the way they negotiate and design sanctions regimes, they try to take those interests into account sometimes. Those interests are also able to defend themselves, I would say, at the European level. Lobbies exist in Brussels, so that's a fact. But when it comes to the parliamentarian resolutions, I mean, it's fair that that parliamentarians would express their position. It doesn't change the position of the French government. And actually, I would advise that you take a close look to the 2 resolutions that were adopted, one in the French National Assembly and the other in the Senate, whereas the resolution in the Senate was much more balanced, I would say, and much more compatible with the European position on the lifting of sanctions.
Wonderful. I think we can take one more round of questions, and we'll go to this side, Ariel, and then to David. Ariel?
Ariel Cohen, the Atlantic Council, thank you very much for a terrific presentation, Special Ambassador Fried. What is Plan B? Let's make an exercise here. In a year, there's no longer political will and a lot of economic pressure to lift the sanctions on Russia, and we have pretty much a status quo in Ukraine. What are alternative tools, and what is the Plan B if we do give up sanctions? Would that allow the gross violation of international law that was committed by the Russian Federation to stand, and we'll just smile and go back to business as usual and sell the airplanes and do other things? Thank you.
Hi, thanks. It's Emily Meredith from Energy Intelligence. And we're talking about transatlantic cooperation, but there are some differences with the specifics of the US and EU sanctions in relation to Russia. For example, last week we had Russian energy minister say that Gazprom and Shell were ready to sign a deal for operations of Yuzhno-Krinskoye, and apologies for my pronunciation. But that's specifically targeted by the US but not by Europe. So how should we be thinking about that issue in that field specifically, but also just more broadly, these very specific differences?
Hi, David Riley from the British Embassy. And it's a question for perhaps Simone or Dan. I wouldn't put it to Philip. I want to come at sustainability from a different angle, if I may. The UK government would welcome lifting sanctions on Russia if it meant we had full implementation of Minsk, and we absolutely support our German and French friends in pursuing that goal. But if we're honest, we will still face at that point a Russia that is increasingly divergent from the West in terms of its values, its actions, and its rhetoric. So with something like the Wassenaar arrangements in mind, what can we learn from the sanctions regime of the last couple of years about Europe or the West's future economic policy towards Russia?
Thank you. Since we're just almost at the end of our conversation, I'll allow our panelists to both respond to questions and any quick summary. I just do, maybe to a sharper point to both David and Ariel's question, really over the last several months, which hasn't received an enormous amount of attention, actually ceasefire violations have increased at some point to levels even reaching when Minsk II was negotiated, yet there was not any signaling or strengthening. And it sort of gets to your hypothetical, Dan, about if we see progress, let's recognize good news, but is there an ability to acknowledge when the difficulties are actually, the ceasefire violations are increased on the ground? And Philip, I appreciate your comment that the political part of that is very challenging, so I just wanted to add that point to it. So why don't we just start with Simone and we'll work our way down the table, and Liz, in keeping with tradition, we'll let you have the final say.
Well, first of all, allow me to say that the report is now online, so feel free to consult it on both CNAS and CSIS websites. But beyond my own advertising, once again, I mean, this theoretical question is today irrelevant. So we can ask a lot of theoretical questions which would make Lucas weak or incapable of achieving policy objectives, but the fact is that sanctions, EU ambassadors today agree to roll over sanctions. It doesn't mean that there are no uncertainties for the future. I think this situation is here with us and will be here with us for a long time. So we come back to the sustainment issue, but as of today, I really don't see the interest, both for the United States and for the European Union, to put themselves into that situation or into that state of mind. I don't think it adds a contribution to our common efforts. With regard to the question about economic diversification or how the European Union and Russia are going to see the economic relations going forward, I mean, geography is not going to change anytime soon. And so if sanctions once are lifted, I don't really see why the European Union and Russia could not cooperate economically. That being said, there might be vulnerabilities within the European economies that might benefit from us taking a look at those. And I wrote a report about Russia sanctions where I argued that perhaps sanctions could also play a role in the way we could envision us crafting a deterrence approach. But as of today, I mean, there are constraints on what European companies are able to do, and that's the restrictions that we need to observe.
Yeah, thank you. I think, frankly, there is no plan B because it's very difficult to imagine that, you know, the European Union just gives up the sanctions, says, oh, that was an idea like communism or something which didn't work out. No, I mean, it's not going to happen. I think that we have to have a solution to this problem. It will be a difficult one, but the idea that we say, oh, Minsk, it didn't work out, so let's list the sanctions is not an option. So I think, why should we deliberate on this scenario when it is very unlikely? I think that, having said that, you know, Russia will be a very, very important part for European economic life. You know, that's because of geography, basically, as Simon said. We will be trading and doing business with Russia in the years to come, and we have to, and it's in our mutual interests. Germany had, as you know, we had developed a very, very close relation with Russia that through this Ukraine disaster was destroyed, basically. I mean, we went back to square one in our relations with Russia because of that. But that doesn't mean that we don't do business. We do business with all sorts of countries, you know, countries that are much more difficult than Russia. But that be doing business with countries doesn't mean that we allow countries to violate flagrantly international law like the Russians did in Ukraine and eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So I think, yes, it will be a partner, an economic partner. We will be at the same time we will be very careful when it comes to their international political actions. We have seen that they behave in an unacceptable way, basically. The last point I want to make, this sort of, is there these differences between European sanctions agreement and US sanctions agreement is a problem. It's a problem, and in these areas where we don't overlap will always be a problem. But that's, it has good reasons why it is like this. We have to be, we have to keep in mind our jurisdiction. The Americans have their jurisdiction. So I think there will be always little frictions every now and then because of that. We have to try to heal them as well as possible, and there are certainly possibilities to do something like that. But at the end of the day, because of the different structures and shapes of our sanctions regimes, sometimes you'll have little problems that can't be resolved.
Certainly there are second-order differences between U.S. and European sanctions, and I suspect Philip is right. There are few enough of these in practice that we can handle them on a case-by-case basis and just live with it. Because of the low price of oil, any differences in energy sanctions are less critical, though they exist, and there are some cases. The financial sanctions, banks have been sufficiently cautious that this is a theoretical, not a practical problem, at least so far. But I want to discuss the issue of Plan B. Happily, Ariel, the cave nightmare, right, where the West just folds, extremely unlikely, and I will refer to Philip's statement. I think that's unlikely, but let me play out your point about status quo, what we do in a year, what it looks like if Minsk doesn't make progress, but things are as they are. In that case, if Ukraine's reforms are taking hold and their economy is beginning to grow, and if the U.S. does something Adam Zubin has talked about, the Treasury Undersecretary, and maintains its sanctions, that is, adjusts its sanctions to maintain the intended pressure on the Russian economy, then we might be in a more comfortable situation than you probably have in mind. That is, time might start to work for us. If Ukraine is developing and the situation on the ceasefire line is not great, but the Russians do not dare launch major military assaults, and the Russian economy is still under pressure, that's not a terrible place for the West to be in, because Ukraine begins to grow and Russia's under pressure. So think about as you're spinning out the possibilities, and I know you are, think about good outcomes and what an acceptable outcome might be for us, where we can hold our position more comfortably than the Russians. It's a thought. I'm not giving you a policy, right? But we've been thinking about this. The long term, and where we end up with respect to Russia is something that the next U.S. administration working with the EU is going to have to think about. And that's our British, that's David's question. What do we do about high technology transfer to Russia? What you're asking is, what's the new normal? And I can't answer that yet because I don't know how things will resolve in Ukraine, and we hope that Minsk will succeed. But it's a larger challenge for all of us. Where do we end up? And of course, we can do business with Russia. I mean, to be more specific about what Philip was talking about, and starting with pipelines. Okay, we had a huge fight 30 years ago about pipelines. The US lost. Russia became a supplier of natural gas to Europe. That created a European dependency, particularly pronounced in Central Europe. However, starting 6-7 years ago, the United States and Europe started working together to mitigate the consequences of that dependency. And as a result, Europe has started building an impressive infrastructure of secondary pipes, gas pipelines, which makes it much harder for the Russians to cut off gas to Central Europe while continuing to supply it to Germany. And for example, it is a fact that Ukraine is receiving Russian gas through reverse flows, which means that Russian leverage over Europe is much decreased, while Russia and Europe continue to do business on gas. And it's a kind of, it shows that practical arrangements to achieve the right strategic result can sometimes work in practice, even though you've had a huge fight in theory, 30 years ago. So we may end up there, and I'll just take your question as a challenge a legitimate challenge for the future.
And a future CSIS discussion. We're a little running over time, so I'll just ask you to be
Very briefly. I'm only going to respond to one of the questions about what we can learn about U.S., and I may be taking a few liberties here to remold the question, but I will answer the question, what can we learn about U.S. and EU, perhaps coercive financial policy, from the experience of Russia? A couple of things. First, for better or for worse, depending on how you think about this, the genie's out of the bottle. There's no turning back. It's a very innovative space that policymakers in Europe and in the United States have come to think of as a set of tools of first resort. And in, excuse me, and in a fiscal context where people are not keen to rush into expensive military expenditure and they're interested in a little more bite than diplomacy, this looks to many people like a good option. And I think we should acknowledge that that comes with what I think is probably an inadequate appreciation of the costs of using this tool. But nevertheless, there's a broadly held perception that this is a real go-to policy tool, and that's not going away. Brexit, a U.S. administration change, another Congress, other significant political elections in Europe, that's still on the table. And because it's a space that we've come to think of as very innovative, with a lot of creativity that we have seen demonstrated in the Russia sanctions, both in terms of transatlantic cooperation, new authorities that target specific financial instruments, I think we should expect to see more of that to target more national security challenges in the future.
Liz, thank you so much. I apologize for going a little over, but this was such an important conversation. Congratulations, Simone. A great report. What a privilege it has been to have you with us for the last 2 years. Liz, thank you for your partnership in this report. We always like to partner with other think tanks. Dan, you're always so good to us, and thank you for your clarity of thought. Please come back and keep helping us understand Plan B. Philip, fantastic. We really appreciate your cooperation and your strong statements. We're going to continue to follow this story. Thank you for being with us, and have a great day. Thank you.